Yeah,
All right.
be our little
Welcome
secret.
back to another episode. Welcome, Eric, to the podcast. It's great to have you on.
Mike, thanks for having me here. My pleasure.
So, we've known each other for a while. How long's it been, by the way?
Well, dating back to that photo that you sent over, it was 2009. I want to say that we knew each other before that, and I forget if that was my first or second open group conference where we were out having a good time.
Yes. Now, we met for the first time physically there, but you and I have been following each other for quite some time now, right?
I believe so. If memory serves correctly, it's the hashtag ENTARCH or ENTARC over on Twitter. A few folks, some who I would refer to as the usual suspects in the enterprise architecture community.
Right. And unlike the mafia, I think we got out somewhat unscathed, right?
For the most part, I haven't seen any slow-moving vehicles going by my house, but the skill set and the mindset it's still there.
Yeah.
It's another skill that we've picked up along the way that we can leverage in our day-to-day activities.
So now, before we get into it too far, you and I have known each other for a while, but other listeners may not know who you are. So maybe give us a summary of who you are, your role, some of the things that you're doing.
Great, thank you. So I'm. You could say I'm an enterprise architect, but I'm not, and perhaps that's the first rule of enterprise architecture is not to talk about it. But I help customers evolve their business and technical capabilities and then help build business cases to justify that evolution. And I think that is somewhat of a characteristic of enterprise architecture. And so I work now for what I'll characterize as a leading data management software company in a pre-sales capacity, advising customers. I've been in a similar role in a few other companies, have background in management consulting, a little bit of time in a similar role over at Oracle, a lot of time in my career in industry. So spent some time at Excel's Blue Cross Blue Shield as an enterprise architecture leader in driving that program forward. And really, I like to say I grew up as an applications developer. And you're not going to ask me what language I started on, right?
Well, I didn't bring it up. You brought it up. So now you just opened yourself up for it. So
I
tell me,
sort
what
of
was your
did.
first language here?
It was COBOL.
Oh, COBOL.
It was COBOL coming out of college. I like to say I'm old enough to know COBOL, young enough to have avoided punch cards, which I am very grateful for.
Yeah, so it was funny. In my career, I started out in C, C++, and pepper in a little Power Builder in there as well back in the day. But it wasn't until maybe 3 or 4 years into my career where I was in the banking world and I got thrown right back in a time machine and into COBOL land. And so while I didn't start off with that particular programming language, I most certainly ended up dabbling with COBOL copybooks and those sorts of things.
Oh, yeah. Good stuff. Good stuff. And there's quite a demand for it right now from what I see in the headlines.
I tell you, if
unfortunately,
if you are a person that has spent your career in that world and you're retired and all that great stuff, and you want to make some extra cash, that is a definite pathway to getting some pretty hefty bill rates.
Yeah, I would call that the ultimate side hustle. It reminds me of the Y2K days when they were chasing people down on golf courses saying, please come back.
Right.
We need you, right?
Please. So like you said, when we last physically saw each other, we were in San Francisco, and we were having, let's say, a tasting. I understand you might just have a bourbon in your hand. By chance, what are you drinking?
Well, tonight. I am drinking, and I might get the classification wrong, but this is a Woodford Reserve Kentucky straight rye whiskey.
Nice.
And I'm drinking it neat, in case you want to know. How about you?
I think.
What are you working on right now?
Well, so here's the thing. If you're not drinking it neat, I don't know what you're doing. But I'm somewhat of a purist myself, so I've got a little Woodford Reserve as well. It's the double oaked variety.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
it's very very tasty.
Yes.
And I'm kind of a whiskey bourbon snob. I just love bourbon. I think it's one of those cool things that. Well, before I go there, how cool is it? We didn't even rehearse this. You're drinking Woodford and I'm drinking Woodford. How cool is that?
Correct. Correct.
So I knew I liked you. But what's interesting, and maybe it's just the anal retentiveness of myself, or the perfectionist side to be a little bit friendlier. But what's really cool about bourbon is just the precise steps that they take to make bourbon, and that it's very formulaic. It cannot veer from it. It actually, believe it or not, it was the first regulated food product in the country. Believe it or not.
No kidding.
Yeah, it's fascinating, the history behind bourbon, because it is essentially what I'll say, and I'm kind of propping it up on a pedestal here, but that's okay. I can, because I've got the microphone right now. It's actually one of our kind of national treasures, because it's the first and only American spirit. I didn't actually know that till maybe a couple months ago.
That that does sound familiar to me. I had the opportunity last summer to take one of the first in a series of courses for wine from the Court of Master Sommeliers. And so I say one of the first. It's the first, not necessarily planning on others. And we do cover a bit of, here's bourbon, whiskey, spirits, I believe was that section that we're supposed to cover. And it certainly is something very American. Now, granted, bourbon does fall under the whiskey category, and we certainly know our whiskeys from across the pond. And I suppose it's not do I like, Scotch is better than whiskey. It's almost the Neapolitan versus deep dish conversation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's what you prefer.
Yeah. And, the decoder ring in my mind is, if you like barley, then you're going to gravitate towards Scotch. If you like a sweeter taste, bourbon's the place to be, because it's, as 51% corn, and it's got, a sweeter taste to it. And then, with whiskey, whiskey can be all sorts of different varieties. And that's what's interesting. What I really like about bourbon is, it's very specific. It's, everything from the barrel that it's in and the degrees of, level of char, to a fresh oak barrel, can't be blended and all this stuff. It's super cool. But this podcast isn't necessarily about bourbon. I could talk about it all day, but, for me, I think what's really cool is being able to have conversations with, friends, family, colleagues, over a bourbon that's neat, because, it's not a bourbon if it's got ice in it and all that great stuff. But it's, it's about kind of enjoying the conversation, and it's something that's meant to take time. And that's, I think, in today's world is really, really tough, because everyone's, always slammed, everyone's busy, trying to make their lives more productive and make things go faster. But there's also something to actually slowing things down deliberately.
It's great for one's mental health. And I think about in this mid to post, let's hope for post-pandemic world that we live in. And for folks like ourselves that are working remotely all the time anyway, it's so easy to just keep the pedal all the way to the floor, 10, 12 hours, and it's just always there. And to find those outlets in our lives that go back to analog, if you will. Let's use that word. And whether that's cigars or whiskey or wine, it's a different world. And for me, I'm not as deep on the whiskey world, but the wine world I find fascinating, especially in Europe, how analog it still is. When we think about 21st century internet, and I've got gigabit to my house here in the boonies of upstate New York, and yet over in Europe they're hand picking the grapes, and they're hand sorting. The owner of the vineyard is hand sorting as the grapes are coming down the line. The amount of meticulousness is amazing to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's something to that, and what I've said time and time again is that humans, you and I, whether we like it or not, we're analog, and we're just trying to live in a digital world. And we really need to come to grips with that. Is that whether it be how we make decisions or what we like and don't like, is we're still very much, we're not a computer, we're not digital, we enjoy the tactile essence of things. We like to be able to slow down and enjoy things versus from what we see oftentimes pushed on us, which is, hey, let's be much more efficient, let's do this, let's do that. And that's why I think things like record players are coming back in a big way. Having books in a library, and being able to sit down and actually touch a nice hardbound book is coming back, because we're like, yes, it's great to have 200,000 books on our Kindle, but we also enjoy the smell of a book, the feel of a book, being able to sit down and actually, enjoy it on your own speed, etc. So I 100% agree with you. Now, transitioning to something that is another thing near and dear to our hearts besides bourbon, enterprise architecture. And we've spent a lot of our careers in this space, and it's been a colorful journey. At least for me, it has. I guess just kind of open us up here. Is what's your feelings towards enterprise architecture these days? You're not like 100% entrenched in it anymore, but now kind of looking back, what's your feelings towards it?
It is certainly, I'm in a different spot from a career standpoint and an employment standpoint, because I don't formally carry the title, nor is there a group known as the Enterprise Architecture Group, much like I've had in the past. But it certainly doesn't diminish what I'll call it a discipline brings to the table, because it really is less about an ideology and such, but it's a tool that we use to solve problems at the end of the day. And anyone that's been in the IT business or business world, for that matter, has had a large set of tools in their bag. Could be Six Sigma, could be something as small as the 5 Whys, the Ishikawa diagram, other sorts of techniques that we have used for decades. And I have found myself in this part of my career looking at enterprise architecture as a means to an end.
Yeah,
And I'll confess, you're going to be my priest, that I may not have always felt that way. And it's certainly fun at the open group or other sorts of gatherings to really nerd out on what enterprise architecture is. And honestly, I used to do it with IT as well. But at the end of the day, it's understanding that it's a means to an end to solve a problem.
No, I agree, and I think the challenge, at least that I've seen, reflecting back, is, we you get so far entrenched into the nomenclature, the specific problem sets of the enterprise architecture space, and you sometimes, are so deep in it that you lose perspective. And some of the things that I've learned coming, stepping away, and like you said, this, enterprise architecture is, just like project management. It's just like design thinking and other things. It's a methodology that you use when you need it, and you orchestrate it for the right problems at the right time. So it's not like one of these things where it's like, well, I'm not an enterprise architect anymore. It's, I don't have to identify myself as an enterprise architect. I'm a change agent to some degree. I'm an innovator to some degree, etc. And I just so happen to use some of these really nifty tool sets in this enterprise architecture discipline to help me be more successful. And I think the challenge is the navel gazing that tends to happen in a space that is somewhat niche, somewhat undefined, and you kind of get lost in all of it. And so you start talking about how great, one framework or methodology is versus another, and it's just it's not a productive conversation. And unfortunately, I revisited some predictions I made almost a decade ago, all the way back in 2011, 2012 timeframe, and where I thought that enterprise architecture was going to be much further along than where it is right now. Now, a lot of the predictions, I was in the ballpark as far as how I thought things would turn out. It's just they weren't far enough that, based on the momentum that I thought was there, they just didn't make the progress. And it seems like almost to some degree has stalled out a little bit as far as evolving the discipline. I haven't seen a new version of TOGAF since, I don't know, when was the last time, Eric? 2009, 10 timeframe?
I don't recall. I went through the certification process. I think it was still 9.1, and they were talking about TOGAF Next, but I don't think there was a Next. Wasn't Next supposed to be version 10?
Should have been 10. Yeah, they I got to be careful what I say here. But essentially, 9.2 is the latest version. And, what we talked about all the way back at that conference that we were at, was doing something much more revolutionary and, taking it much further than where it's at. It didn't happen that way, unfortunately. So,
yeah, go ahead.
No. So based on that, what were some of the things that you think that should have been focused on and, better evolved from then to now? Because I don't know if you share my opinion, but I think it hasn't been as fast of a progression as I would have preferred, at least.
I think the hazard that we experienced with enterprise architecture was more because it was birthed out of an IT department or an IT mindset and folks that were focused on technology-based solutions and perhaps a lack of emphasis around business architecture, which I consider part of enterprise architecture, along with other, call it 4, call it 5 subdivisions that go in there, and really understanding the differences between the different domains and the need to understand what enterprise architecture was really trying to do. It was a new name that was coined. There was a paper written by Zachman, 1987, I believe, was the year, IBM Systems Journal. It's floating around on this laptop somewhere. But it wasn't necessarily new. It was connecting the dots differently to solve a business problem. Because if you recall and look, Zachman was an engineer by trade. He worked at Boeing. So he was borrowing those techniques. So really it was less about enterprise architecture. It was really enterprise engineering is what he was proposing. And in that discipline, boiling it down to something simple. So I've had to explain this to our sales engineers at the company I work at now. And by the way, I'm speaking for myself tonight, folks. It really is just understanding all the elements, the pieces and parts of an enterprise and how they interrelate. Now that sounds really simple, but when you boil it down, it's almost metaphysical is what you're doing, because an enterprise is a very complex entity when you think about it. It's made up, yes, today in 2020, it's made up of a lot of technology. There are processes in varying degrees of definition. And then there's the wild card. There are humans involved. And as we were talking about,
humans.
right, we're not 100% rational beings. Sorry, Mr. Spock, but we are not. So we have to, it's harmonizing all of those components and understanding what the relationships are. Because I believe sometimes an outcome in the business can be driven by a relationship that we don't see between two elements. And because we don't, just because we can't see it doesn't mean it's not there and not making an impact. And that's what I recall talking with John Zachman. It was in his class, and he's saying all organizations, all enterprises have an architecture They have a structure, a collection of pieces and parts and relationships between them. They're all in varying degrees of documentation and understanding.
Yeah.
And
You make some phenomenal points here, and I'm going to take a small step back, and I think the actual problem is in the name itself. Is enterprise architecture. I don't think that is a very descriptive name of what an enterprise architect should be doing. Um, you know, you know, Zachman, when he came up with the Zachman framework, uh, and it's only until here, later that he actually renamed the Zachman framework to the Zachman ontology, right? And
yes,
what it was really about with Zachman was having a level of completeness, and so as old school as it was, whenever I had an enterprise architecture practice, I would always have the Zachman framework kind of in the background as the way of mapping to have we thought of everything. But here's the thing: not every problem is going to require each one of those boxes to light up. It's like as Zachman would say today is it's like the periodic table of elements. If I'm trying to create a particular material, I'm going to light up those boxes differently. I'm going to use different minerals and chemicals and all that great stuff. And so I think the problem is when it was birthed out of that kind of perspective of, let's make sure that we identify all the possible permutations of elements to this thing called enterprise architecture is how we got to that name. But that's, I think, gets us into a lot of trouble because it definitely, like you said earlier, it puts it into a connotation of, this is an IT thing. But really, at the end of the day, if anything, this is a business thing. It's not a technology thing. Enterprise architecture is about being a change agent for your business. And you just so happen to use the technology and the tools at your disposal. What do you think?
Well, I think that's spot on, and you touch on something that I've pontificated on a few times, is around being in the IT space and are we solving IT problems? And we're not. The reality is there are no IT problems. There are only business problems to solve. So there are no, we see, when you have a machine learning problem, no, you don't. You have a business problem that you're going to go into the tool bag and say, you know what? Some linear regression, some other ML techniques that I don't fully understand yet, by the way, are going to be very suitable here to help me get, because what am I trying to do? What is the outcome I'm looking for? It's not to add machine learning to my resume and play around with the Python libraries. It's to figure out what market I should go into. What products are going to be most profitable in which markets? Those types of decisions. Now, that being said, it's always fun to play with a new technology, but we have to contextualize it correctly.
Yeah.
So I'm in a wholehearted agreement there on that point.
And that's where to segue into what we talk about a lot on this podcast, which is innovation. And companies today are going through a bit of a soul searching journey these days. There is a lot of disruptive forces that are being slammed upon organizations over the past couple of years, whether it be societal trends where we've got a new generation of consumers that expect different things from businesses, from their technology, whether it be what we're facing right now with the global pandemic. Who saw that coming? Maybe Bill Gates saw it coming, but for the
Yeah, I
rest
was
of us
just
normal
about to say that.
For the rest of us normal people, we didn't see it coming.
Yeah.
But also, all these other things, that are all non-technology driven, whether it be, some of the social and ethical things that are no longer acceptable, where we start talking about things like, ethical AI, we start talking about making sure that technology is available in the hands of everybody, etc. There's a lot of pressure on organizations that have been doing the same thing and have been operating in a mode for so long, and now they're being asked to change. And I think this is the opportunity that enterprise architecture has to step up and get a seat at that big boy and girl table to actually start to influence things. Now, for you, Eric, I mean, do you see enterprise architecture organizations stepping up to that challenge, or do you see them reverting back or staying kind of in the I'll call the EA classic mode?
I think it's going to be more the EA classic mode. And I think it's going to be very interesting over the next 6, 12, 18 months to see what IT in general does, but also enterprise architecture groups, whether they reside in EA, or excuse me, in IT groups or outside, different conversation, right? Or folks that at least think with an EA mindset what's going to happen. You've probably seen the fictional tweet asking who drove your digital transformation in 2020. Is it the CIO, CFO, or COVID-19?
Right.
I think COVID has really prompted organizations, or should be prompting the smarter organizations, to take a real hard look at how they're conducting business, because the world has certainly changed. We've gone from, or I should say, we've gone to every possible knowledge worker being remote. And for some, it was almost a no-brainer. I think for others, it was a big transition. My own brother is a design engineer in the manufacturing space. Suddenly, in 30 years, was working at home for the first time.
Right.
The world really changed. And there are some advantages to that. I mean, in our organization, we've been able to, we can touch more customers in a day because we're not driving around or flying around. It's one Zoom call after another, which, whether or not that's good for one's own mental health, another conversation. I'm not qualified to comment on that. But I think it's prompting organizations to take a hard look at how resilient they are and also how innovative they are. I mean, there's certain, I ran across a stat today from CB, I'll quote CB Insights. We're not sponsored by them, but you're welcome to send a check, guys. The amount of retail business that is now considered e-commerce, to use that really old term, right? I want to bring it up here real quick. The number over, let's go back to 2009, only 5.6% of retail was e-commerce, and it goes up to, in 2019, 16%. By April 2020, it was 27%. It ramped up.
Yeah, so this reminds me of, some of the conversations I would have with clients. I'm remembering vividly. I'm at a Gartner symposium. I'm in the speed dating booths. If you've ever been to a Gartner conference and you want to talk to an analyst, you've got to put your name in the hat, and you're going to be one of thousands of people that gets allocated for 30 minutes to one of the analysts. And the analyst is just like, it's in and out. It's like a speed dating thing. And, I would constantly be asked by, whether it be enterprise architects or innovators, they'd say, what can I do to get people to move? I'm speaking logically to them. I think I'm making a great case. And, I had a hypothesis, and the hypothesis was this. It was, for change to happen, bad things need to happen. There needs to be an event, that a defining event, whether it's, the stock took a plummet due to whatever X reason, whether, I'd face this, early in my career, I was working for a company where, the CIO said bad things to the regulators, and the regulators fired the guy, and they got a whole new leadership staff, and they booted up an EA team, and, better things happened as a result. But it took that event for those better things to happen.
Right.
Likewise, I think here with COVID, I have not seen the amount of transformation conversations. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't use Zoom. I work for Microsoft now, so I'm a Teams guy, which I'm pretty happy with, to be honest with you. And I'd tell you if I wasn't, because I'm pretty vocal about that sort of thing. But I'm hopping on these Teams calls, and suddenly it's no longer selling people on why they should digitally transform. Now it's like, we got some catching up to. How can we accelerate this thing? We're gonna reallocate budget here and there. And you're like, where have you guys been? And all it took was this major event called COVID. So I think
Right.
you're spot on. I think that's 100% right. Now, what do you think enterprise architects should be doing to really embrace this as an opportunity?
I think that the word I would use if I had to boil it down to one is be proactive.
Yeah.
Start putting together your plans, pitch your idea, gather the data to support your idea, build the business case for making this change. I'm not an epidemiologist, but who's to say that we're not going to have a COVID-20 or some other similar event? We call these black swan events, right? Let's be ready for those events. Let's take advantage of it. The technology is there for these organizations. It's there. We use Microsoft. We're Microsoft Teams, Microsoft 365 customers, right? We use that as well, and just that small move to reduce reliance on having to go into a data center.
Yeah.
That's a very simple step. But other things I think about too, right? There's layers, and this is a Jean Ross ism, and I forget her most recent book. It's a real colorful one, not the EA strategy book. But she talks about the difference between digital and digitization. And digitization could be the same thing as transformation. And I think elements of transformation that people need to do aren't that sexy, but they need to be done in order to build a solid foundation so that these organizations can start increasing the number of digital offerings that they have. What do I mean by that? Let's call it transformation, it's digitization, whatever you want to call it, right? It's reducing technical debt. How many database engines do you really need? How many ERPs do you really need? In my experience back to Oracle, love them or hate them, but they were ruthless about that type of portfolio rationalization. They ran one instance of a CRM globally. They weren't about to do replications for regions that didn't have good network. You know how they solved that problem? They beefed up the network. It was hyper-focused on a rationalized portfolio of technology, and that's going to provide savings from a licensing standpoint, and certainly productivity and speed to get to the information. And that's what's critical. This is a time, right? I think this is the time for enterprise architects to dig in, do the homework. Those projects that have been languishing, dust them off, start moving. Some of the data that I'm seeing, Mike, suggests there was a Gartner quote around cloud, right? Let's use cloud as, I'll be clear here, cloud is a means to an end. So just going to cloud is not your transformation. But if cloud is part of your digitization or transformation program, I think this is relevant. They would see, Gartner saw that this was going to be an accelerator. The folks over at Flexera, in a survey that was done this year, they were starting to see an uptick in enterprises and SMB with regard to cloud spending. So I think people are going to take advantage of this now. Now, what's interesting, Mike, is an article that I saw from Gartner suggesting that IT spending overall will be down about 8% this year as a result of COVID. Now, what I couldn't find in the numbers, and it was very, very small bit of data, was the cloud piece. And again, cloud piece as a proxy for digitization or other advanced methods, because I imagine people are going to want to take advantage of that when they realize that they couldn't send their staff in to work on servers or to do, receive new equipment, things of that nature. We're getting down to brass tacks here, but I think these are the realities organizations are facing in order to maintain their resiliency.
No, I totally agree. And so one of your key recommendations is being proactive, and I 100% agree with that. I think you've got to, in a lot of ways, these enterprise architects, they're smart guys and gals. They get it. Now it's been a question of opportunity, and having the opportunity to step up. And I think that being proactive, most certainly need to be proactive. You need to also be number two. You need to be empathetic and really understand based on what is happening. I mean, these businesses are getting decimated, as far as, the scorecard goals of these executives because they're mapped to the old way of doing things. And now they've got to quickly shift. And I think enterprise architects have an opportunity to really be there to help support and really be that trusted advisor. And the only way you do that is, one, being empathetic, and two, being humble. One of the biggest issues that I've seen with enterprise architects is the ego bit, and I think we all have suffered from that to some degree in the past. But it's really taking a step back and saying, you know what, it's not really about me, and I may or may not be the smartest person in the room, but that doesn't matter. We're here to contribute to our business, and we're here to drive it forward. So what can I do as a resource that has a speciality in a particular area to really help move the business forward? And I think that's some of the key challenges that enterprise architects face is really that ability to connect with their partners and their business partners. It could be their legal partners. It could be lots of different. It could be even within the technology division as well. It doesn't matter. But also being able to connect with them and say, look, I understand these goals and objectives. Here's how I'm going to help you get there. Trust me. I'm going to help you through this. And that is super, super challenging. It's a hard skill to learn, especially if you're not. That doesn't come naturally to you. It's something that you have to just constantly work on. But I think those soft skills, especially now, are so vital. And this is kind of, in my opinion, this is kind of one of those make or break moments for many enterprise architects that want to stay in the kind of the true EA discipline and not necessarily the solution architecture discipline where I'm dealing with more, of the technologies, at a project solution level. But really, if you want to be a true enterprise architect, I think this is the test. This is the time where it's, we're really going to measure you as an EA.
And that I think you brought up some great points there. I wrote them down. The two words were empathy and humility, and those I don't recall those being very present in the EA methodologies. And it's not a criticism of the methodologies because they're there to serve a purpose around defining a organizing framework for solving problems. But the empathy and humility, that's out of I put that in my leadership domain bucket amongst reading and such. And certainly the stories I've read, I have frequented the Jocko podcast from time to time. And these concepts of empathy and humility and mission focus just permeate his books, other books that he recommends, other literature out there. And pick up any book on leadership, civilian or otherwise, and you'll find these concepts around empathy and humility, building trust and building the relationship. Having all the data points and dots ticked and the T's crossed and such, but these are the elements I think I agree with you that are going to pull an effort across that finish line and make real organization change.
And I'll tell you, I mean, I mean, it's probably been about 3 years now, maybe 4 years. I was doing a workshop for it was a 150-year-old insurance company, so. I mean, you can't imagine a more conservative place, right? And they had brought me in to help them with essentially more of kind of an ideation, business envisioning type of session. And at the end of it, I went to the I think it was the chief digital officer, and I said, okay, so how did you feel about the day? How did you feel about the outcomes, this and that? And she was like, I think I really liked it. I got a lot of value out of it. But I tell you, it really wasn't about the workshop, though. It wasn't really about the content that I'm really excited about. It's you were able to get people that have never had a conversation before to be highly productive together. This is even people that were more adversarial to cooperate together. Those are the types of things I think EAs need to focus on is that bringing of people together. It's not about them. It's not about their great idea. It's about us coming together as a team. And sometimes, and this was a hard lesson for me early in my career, because I wanted to be right and I had great ideas, but sometimes you just gotta let that go and say, maybe I'm gonna let it be someone else's idea, and I'm gonna seed the conversation and let them feel comfortable with this idea. And yeah, some could say, well, that's maybe some form of manipulation in some way, but it's really about getting people comfortable with the journey. And at the end of the day, they're coming up with the same conclusions that you come up with. It's just they weren't in that mindset, and you're kind of helping them get into that mindset.
I've heard it described by another Gartner analyst, Betsy, and I forget her last name.
Burton, yeah.
And she mentioned, what, pardon?
Betsy Burton.
Betsy Burton.
Yeah.
And she said, I want to give credit here where credit's due, that this type of activity, whether you call it enterprise architecture, management consulting, ideation, is often family counseling.
Oh, yeah, totally.
And you're bringing people together, and defining an objective outside of all of them is the key. And I recall there's a section or a document, I think it's a section in a document within TOGAF called Stakeholders and Their Concerns. And it's our challenge to come up with who are the key stakeholders, aka people that can say no, and what are their key concerns? How can we harmonize them towards a common objective within the enterprise? And that's a skill that is not taught in any of the technical textbooks. I think that's in the psychology department, I believe.
Yeah, and one of those deliverables in that particular area of TOGAF is particularly interesting, and I would not recommend people use this. Sorry, open group, is the stakeholder power grid. Where you essentially map out everybody and you say who has power and who doesn't have power. I mean, if that got in the wrong hands, boy, you're toast. So, that's one of those things where maybe you want to have that conversation over a couple bourbons. And if you do it on the back of a napkin, make sure you burn that bad boy. But outside of that, please don't do that.
Yeah.
It's just a bad career move.
Yeah, I would agree on that one as well. That's a double top secret document there for sure.
So, we've been kind of circling this, which is really about enterprise architecture and innovation. Are these, at odds with each other? This enterprise architecture and innovation type of concept, or do you think that these are synergistic? And have you seen enterprise architects doing this well in your experience?
I would say, working backwards here, I have not seen it done well. I don't think that these two ideas are at odds with each other. And I think that any innovation effort, I think we have to first define what we mean by innovation. And there's certainly a sense of going after something new. There's a new business problem, new opportunity that we're going to go after. I would not apply innovation to portfolio rationalization, for example.
Right.
And I think if we start with a mindset of innovation, I think there are other skill sets that need to come along with enterprise architecture to make that happen. And I don't remember the guy's name, but he wrote a book called Intersection. And it's really a harmony of a bunch of techniques that would include design thinking and enterprise architecture. And I think that in an innovation effort, I think of design thinking or customer journey mapping or other tools that are out there would complement what enterprise architecture would bring to the table. I think the strength with enterprise architecture, when used correctly, and only as much as one might need, is around the framework. It's an organizing framework, and we use frameworks to organize other parts of our lives. And so bring that to the table. Bring the current state, future state roadmap mindset to the table. But there's other elements. If you're innovating, there's going to be some non-linear activity, non-linear thinking maybe a bourbon fueled along the way. So that's where the design thinking, the customer journey mapping and such to really drive the imagination and really drive the art of the possible and leveraging those tools to define what that current state, or excuse me, target state would be, not to jam it all back into the EA framework. The goal is to achieve the objectives of what the innovation is supposed to be.
Yeah, you know, I
And
think
pull in whatever you need.
yeah, you know, I think you're right, and you know, I think that the challenge is separating the discipline, the framework, the methodologies from the people that are executing these methodologies and frameworks. I think enterprise architects are uh, either currently or will be shortly be faced with challenges that are bigger than just an optimization effort within their enterprise, or as simple as, and you know, I say as simple, but it's actually pretty hard because you and I have both lived through this, where you go to your business sponsor or stakeholder or whatever you want to call them, and you go to them and say, hey, you know, what do you want to do? How do you want to build this? What are some of the key requirements? How resilient does it need to be, etc. And that was hard in and of itself. But really, now is we're in an area of we don't know what we don't know, and whether it be this pandemic and how to figure out what's going to be the new normal, what's going to be the new way of work, to we've got a vibrant community of innovators around these organizations that are actively challenging the status quo in every single industry vertical we have out there. We've got innovations happening. We've got startups that are challenging big behemoths on how they do their business. And you know, my belief is enterprise architects have an opportunity to really embrace that and say, okay, we understand that these things are happening. We have to take a small step backwards. So maybe the first step isn't to go to your business partner and say, what's your vision? Maybe the first step now is, so we don't know exactly where we're going. How about I help you figure that out? How about I help you
Mhm.
bring, you know, some of these capabilities, these technologies that are emerging in the marketplace, these trends that are happening around us? Let me help you uh, organize these thoughts. Let me help you harness that thought process, that energy, so that you can come up with the next vision, not the current vision on how we've thought about it for the past decade, but what should be the vision going forward for the next 5 to 10 years. How does that
And I
resonate
would
with you, Eric?
it resonates well, and I think the time horizon might be a bit shorter. But I found whether I was writing software back in my Power Builder days. By the way, I did have a little stint with Power Builder,
Boy, I love those data
but
windows.
for the time, the data window was pretty cool. It certainly beat a COBOL copybook there. But this idea of going to the user and say, what are your requirements, and leaving it open is tenuous at best. I don't think folks understand what they want. And one of the skills, I think that if we were to look at the DNA of folks that call themselves enterprise architects or behave like them but don't call themselves enterprise architects, is they tend to be a little more horizontal thinking, like they're looking out to the future as opposed to just downward and such. They're going to be able to envision 2, 3 different scenarios that could pan out. And I found just laying out something in front of a stakeholder, even if it's wrong, or even especially if it's wrong, is a great way to get the conversation going and get them to come back and get that reaction.
No, I totally agree. I think that it's actually better to come with either the germ of an idea, or perhaps, you know, the wrong thing to do, to give them an idea of, oh, okay, I know I definitely don't want to do that, or I know that, yes, that's a nugget of something I want to go do. Let's go explore this more. Let's iterate on this some more.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is, you know, another skill that I think that we're kind of indirectly pointing out is really important is, not necessarily proposing kind of the end answer to these stakeholders. This is a journey. It's going to take us some time. And, if you as an enterprise architect, if you go to your enterprise architecture woodshed, in the corner of the building or what have you, and you go and start to design everything up, most likely it's going to be wrong. Because at the end of the day, you're not the guy or the gal that is going to go to jail when bad things happen, and you're not the one that's going to be on the cover of the Wall Street Journal. It's going to be someone else, and there are going to be drivers and motivations that you don't know about. And I hate to break it to some of the super duper modeling folks that want to build motivation models and value analysis, etc. There's just some things where you just got to work it through with your stakeholders, because at the end of the day, you can interview them, but oftentimes it changes as they get different and more information. So it's our job is to be the arbiter of that journey rather than trying to dictate what their journey should be, in my opinion.
Yeah, that resonates. The idea of a Sherpa comes to mind. And the other thought that occurs to me is the enterprise architecture discipline was birthed out of a more deliberate engineering mindset, which was, let's come up with something, and we know what that target state is going to be. We're going to have a stable environment for the foreseeable future. And I think I hate pulling the A word into this, but with a more agile mindset, and by agile, with discipline, to say we're not going to get it right the first time, but let's envision what's next. What is that next phase? What's that next target state for a particular area of the business? Let's ensure that we don't back ourselves into a corner. Let's make sure that we've addressed all the necessary risks so no one ends up in an orange jumpsuit or the business journal, right? And move forward with that. And then take that mindset. And we get the sequence wrong. It's build, measure, learn. Yeah. We're going to build something. Let's test it in the market. Let's not try to perfect it. Let's get it out in the wild. Let's see how our customers and other external stakeholders respond, and then we'll make adjustments along the way. And I think that is something that's going to evolve for those that take on an enterprise architecture mindset. It's going to be essential. And given the amount of new information and change that happens, and the magnitude of impact of something like a COVID-19 will necessitate that. We don't know. We don't know enough about the disease at this point. We don't know how it interacts. We don't know how global economic markets and business are going to react. We have some early clues. We know the verticals that are getting hammered right now, but we don't know in 6 months what's it going to look like. We simply don't know. So having an organized framework to think through the problem, staying light on our feet is, I think, going to be essential as we move forward here.
So as you're talking, one of the things that I'm thinking about as you're talking about that, enterprise architecture was birthed from, this kind of very systematic way of thinking. Times were also much more simplistic than what they are now. I mean, at that time, we were just entering into object orientation, client server, that sort of thing. We didn't have, the very distributed set of architectures that we have today. Do you think, and I'm going to be somewhat controversial here, do you think that enterprise architecture, at least how it was initially envisioned, do you think we've outgrown it?
I think we may have outgrown some elements of it, or outgrown the assumptions that we built it on. As you indicate, change was a bit slower. I'm thinking about the early days of the internet, and I was on this project at a 150-year-old life insurance company, and it was it was, ooh, we got the internet for the first time, and we were, hard coding IP addresses and getting out. It was that fast. So anyway, back to that. I don't know why I brought that back up again. But I think some of those fundamental assumptions, change was a little slower, and it seems to have picked up quite a bit. And we can philosophize about why that is, right? Thank you to Moore's law, we have more computing power than we ever know what to do with. It's sitting in our pockets now, and we're carting it around. They're not phones; they're portable computers. That's certainly exacerbating the problem. But the fluidity at which we can move now, and part of that, we'll go back to Frederick Brooks and the rate of change. Now, he of course predates enterprise architecture, but that was a more extreme case of where things were predictable, because your compile day was assigned to you on Thursday, and hopefully it all went well, so Friday you could start your testing.
Right.
As opposed, right? So the cycle and the amount of change and innovation we can insert is much faster. And so, does enterprise architecture need to catch up to that, or do we just have to rejigger the assumptions and adapt to a more fluidic world? I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. No, my opinion is, I think we share some similar thought processes here. I think that enterprise architecture, how it was originally envisioned, I think it was kind of almost like an evolutionary journey. It was, we have kind of the core competencies that, a enterprise architect has to have. You need to understand the full company. You have to understand all these different slices and perspectives that, we're going to have to think about these problems. So that's all very much required. We need that kind of ontological view of problem sets. The next wave, TOGAF attempted to try to do this, and other frameworks attempted to try to do this, which is to say, okay, now let's think about the approach. So yes, we know you have to ask these questions, but we didn't have a guide to when we ask these questions, how we ask these questions, who do we ask these questions to, etc. It was just, here are the questions, fill out the chart. But as we started to evolve, it was, okay, so how should we approach this? Who should we approach this? How, etc. And I think that was good for a time being, but I think we outgrew that. And, the next wave was really about figuring out the why part of the equation. And so throughout those previous 2 points, I'd never said the word why. And I think kind of in this third stage, and I think we've even outgrown this stage, is, the why, which is, okay, so let's actually figure out, let's digest why our business needs to do this. And that was a natural part of the evolution. I think a lot of enterprise architects are there. I can't, based on my journeys and, conversations with enterprise architecture teams, I can't say that, all of them are there yet, but a lot of them know that is where they either need to be, or some of them are already there. But that next stage of evolution, I think it's challenging the why. It's that process of always saying, is this really the why, or is there another why that, I need to help the company start to tease out? That's the hard jump. And I think for, the really good enterprise architects out there, I think that will come very naturally. I think for others, it may not be as natural, but they can get there. But I think that's going to be the next big jump. That's going to say, will EA really stay where it's at, or will it be rebranded, go to the wayside, be demoted, or actually demote's a strong word, and it's actually not an accurate word, be repositioned as solution architecture? Because I don't look at it as like a hierarchy or anything, but it's just they do different things. Mm-hmm. But I think that it's really going to come down to, are they able to make that leap into this next kind of open innovation, design thinking world that our businesses require them to be at?
And as you say that, Mike, I think part of it is because, as I think I said earlier, EA was birthed out of the engineering or IT domain. And oftentimes some of these frameworks are criticized because they don't address business architecture. I mean, Zachman was the first framework I saw, or ontology, love that word, by the way, where it really honed in on the business in understanding the why. And so it starts to venture out of the IT department or domain and really start getting into the strategy. It's the strategy office. It's the planning, enterprise planning office, a enterprise change management office, and understanding and being able to justify the why is a huge part of this, because at the end of the day, we can draw all the A0 diagrams in the best EA tool. But if we can't first articulate what the journey looks like and then be able to justify that journey, I think back to your why, if I'm understanding you correctly, and being able to build out what that business case looks like and what the value is to the organization. Because at the end of the day, we're proposing change, whether it's through what we would call enterprise architecture, design thinking, customer journey mapping. If it doesn't improve revenue, if it doesn't reduce costs, if it doesn't mitigate risk, it doesn't matter. Even if it's Kubernetes with blockchain and machine learning,
yes,
it doesn't matter. As fun as that would be, that's what your weekends are for, guys and gals, right? Do it on the weekend. If it's not going to impact one of those three items, don't bother.
Yes.
It's not worth it to the business, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not going to help the earnings call if it's a publicly traded company. And all these levers apply. I think that when I think about it, whether it's revenue, risk, or cost reduction, that's a public or private sector value proposition.
Yeah, totally. So if you were king for the day, as scary as that may sound, what changes would you unilaterally change about enterprise architecture? What would be a couple of those things where you'd say, look, these things, I just want to just across the board change, to fit better into kind of where we are today as kind of a modern society?
I think one element I would change, and I like a good descriptive process like the next person, I assure you. But that process needs to resemble more of what the Agile community brings forward with Scrum. That idea of the 2-week sprint, the idea of let's build a backlog of features that would go into an architecture, a design, and then ultimately how those are going to be implemented. I think I would pull that in. I think the other piece of this is the business valuation side and the justification.
I like that.
Because that is the language of business, right? We watch all these sci-fi movies, right? And you're trying to communicate to the aliens. And so what do people do? They start streaming a bunch of prime numbers, right? And some other constants, right? Because math is the universal language, right? Business value is what the CIO is going to understand when you pitch that product or project or programs for that matter. Hopefully. And ultimately, it's the CFO. Because the CFO is going to sign off. They're the gatekeepers of whether or not it's going to be revenue, cost, or risk. They get positively impacted. So and maybe that doesn't belong in the EA framework, but it belongs in the EAs or whatever job title they have, belongs in their tool bag, along with Six Sigma, design thinking, customer journey mapping, all these other tools. I think it's being able to construct that business case. And when I talk about the value, it's not just cheaper by the dozen. It's not always per unit cost. Honestly, that's one dimension. It's getting into more creative calculations around soft benefits of, well, if we do this project, we're going to improve our availability on our systems. Well, so what? Well, that's going to protect revenue on Black Friday. If you're down for an hour on Black Friday, that's real money.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Other sorts of creative calculations. What's the value of your company's R&D for drug research. Averages show that's about $1.5 billion to put a new drug out to market. You lose all that data, how much is that data worth to you? Probably about $1.5 billion. That's billion with a B.
Yeah.
So it's real. It can be quantified. Nobody gets checked, but it's coming up with that, and there's much more of an artful process to that, I think, to coming up with those business cases. And I'm not suggesting creative accounting that's falsified, but to be very transparent with the articulation of the business value. And I think those two elements, I think, and because I'm living it, maybe I'm a little biased right now, but they really go hand in hand. It's like, hey, Eric, Mike, great diagrams, love them. My walls look great right now. I've got this 3-page Microsoft project plan with enough work to keep us busy for the next decade. But why should we do it?
Exactly.
What's the value? What's the business, right? So you can go to the CFO, make that case, and if it doesn't pass that test, sorry, we're going to go find something else.
So I love that, and I think that at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. Now, for enterprise architects, either aspiring enterprise architects or enterprise architects that or trying to get their groove back or whatever it may be, what's some of the advice that you would give enterprise architects based on your experience?
So I would start, I think about verticalization. And what I mean by that is understanding the domain or domains that you play in. And so this is something I borrow from my days over at PwC, and they would talk about this path to partner. The path to partner was always through a vertical and having vertical expertise. And if one is embedded in an organization like a life insurance company or a bank, you have a little more luxury to really drill deep and understand the language of the business. So there's certainly building up an idea or a perspective and your point of view around what you're seeing in those verticals. And weave in some current events like a pandemic, that certainly helps. So there's that understanding. I think there's also the horizontal understanding, and this is how I approach my day-to-day, is understanding what is evolving in some of these key technologies that have come on the scene. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, and then intersect that with banking. And how is it solving business problems? Not necessarily the technology for technology's sake. Blockchain is another one that you talk about, right? It's how does blockchain help a health insurance company, for example, and solve problems there around transaction integrity and such. How does containerization, Kubernetes, and those sorts of items help a retailer going forward? So it's understanding, I think, in the bag is this set of, here are some verticals, here's what I understand is going on in these verticals, and it's plural, especially if you're in a consulting world or an advisory type role. Understanding a set of verticals that you're going to touch, understanding what's going on in the industry. It's being well read in those areas. I think those are the items, and certainly understand your frameworks, but understand they're just that. They're frameworks to help you. You don't work for them. And that's true with any methodology. I saw that with project management back in the day, is people were beholden to filling out the paperwork, but we're not filling out paperwork. We're trying to get something done here.
Yeah.
The methodology works for you, not the other way around.
Yeah, it's when I sometimes it was perceived as positive and sometimes negative, but I believe it through and through is the pithy statement. A fool with a tool is still a fool, right? And that applies most certainly to enterprise architecture. It's, yes, we've got some great methodologies. We've got some great, approaches and deliverables and artifacts and all that great stuff. But, you're the one that has to wield all of those and do it in the appropriate way and make it fit for purpose for the problems that you're trying to solve. So
Completely agree.
So I could talk about this topic as you know from going out and drinking with me for hours, right? We could sit here and talk about EA for a very long time.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's transition. I want to talk about what your current focus is right now, and how are you dealing with very unprecedented but also unpredictable times.
I think for me, and I gave away some of this answer already, is really focusing on the verticals and the horizontals in trying to try as best I can to stay on task, stay close to my customers, and provide the necessary advice and footing to help them in the journey. I think from a business standpoint, that is what we can do. Now, I shared this with my boss's boss the other day, and one of the questions that they call them skip level interviews, or one-on-ones. And so we were supposed to meet with him and really talk about how are you dealing with the pandemic and your customer base. And they put up a slide, and it just said Charlie Mike. And so I never served in the military, but this is a term they use to indicate continued mission. Regardless of what has happened, things may have gone completely sideways, but the message will be, Charlie Mike, I'm going to keep going. Great. I can't get on a plane and go visit my customer and conduct a 3-hour workshop. Fine. Guess what? We've got the technology. We're doing it right now. We can do this remote. We can still maintain that connectedness. And I think that is the largest thing I'm doing now. And certainly for all of us as professionals, it is a good time to dig in and prepare. Because I think as the global economy recovers, and I tend to think it's going to be slow, those that are prepared are going to be the ones that can make the most change going forward. And so it's not, and granted, the jokes go around, oh, we're on pandemic, oh, I'm going to learn a new language, and I'm going to learn how to make my own sourdough by harnessing the yeast in the air. I'm not even going to order the starter off of Etsy. I'm going to do it myself.
Well, I don't know about
and the reality is,
I haven't had any extra time since this pandemic. I've been completely slammed as soon as this thing hit. So I don't have time to make bread and figure out how to get it out of the yeast out of the air. I don't know about you.
No, and I'm actually flipping over to my schedule for this coming week, and it's pretty busy. Last week was pretty busy, just in the number of meetings that have come up, and it's good and it's bad, because at some point I have to think, all right, I love talking to you all, but you've also given me a ton of work to do, and I need quiet time to do that work, and that's what the early mornings are for.
Right.
For me anyway, and unfortunately sometimes on the weekend, but that's yeah. So there's like you, there's been no sourdough baking over here.
No. So with all these meetings that you're having, how have you been helping your customers, with their priorities, helping them kind of move forward, possibly even doing some on the side family counseling for these folks. But what are some of the things that you're focused on to really help these organizations?
I think it's tuning the message, because some of the messaging that we talk about is really not so much around the digitization or necessarily flashy new technology or new business problems to solve, but rather around the resiliency story and making sure the organizations are mitigated their risk. So showing stability, showing the attentiveness, and I think the words you used earlier, empathy and humility. And this was something our CEO emphasized, was leading with empathy and showing that customers, especially early in March or so, it was weird. The world was weird. I recall, and this is getting real primitive here, but walking into a grocery store in mid-March and seeing shelves empty of certain items. That doesn't happen in America, does it?
No, it made me reflect on if you're familiar with the TV show The Walking Dead. It felt very like Walking Dead-ish. When you walk into your supermarket and like it's cleaned out. You're like, are there zombies somewhere or something that I'm just so
Right.
happen to miss? What's going on here?
Yes. Yes. It's being empathetic to that. It's being empathetic to the fact that people, younger families with two working parents, now are also homeschooling their kids in real time. And so being sensitive to that. And for me personally, my kids are older and more self-sufficient. So it was less of an impact on me. So certainly being sensitive to that, being sensitive to their business needs,
Yeah.
what they have right now, especially if I'm talking to somebody in the travel hospitality industry, understanding that 80%, 90% of the revenue just got wiped off the map. And so what's the best way I can help them? Or working with a public utility and helping trim up their cloud costs. Those sorts of actions, just it's taking care of the customer
Right.
at the end of the day. And that is, I've been in this business for 32, let's call it 32 years now. At the end of the day, it's those customer service skills that we all learned working our craft jobs when we were in high school, early days in college, and so on, where you learn just basic, primal customer service.
Any surprises that you've run into that you were like, I didn't expect that, talking with customers?
Say at this point, not so much. I'm positively surprised by some customers continuing with their initiatives, but honestly, not a whole lot of surprises. And not to brag, I think because with a pessimistic mind, thinking, okay, these customers are really going to wind down what they're doing. But some are continuing. Some are smart. There are critical IT services that are still needed, and they still need to make those appropriate investments. And it's a matter of coming up with creative ways to help them sell it internally.
Right. That makes sense. And so as far as some of the things that you're actually offering to them, what are some of the things that you're doing specifically for your customers?
I think in terms of what we're doing, there are some complementary offers that have gone out to our customers, and that's helping them. I think it's going outside of, for me personally, that example I gave you earlier, working with a customer in a different context and helping them through cloud cost optimization. Now, granted, because we're a product company, I'm helping them with the cloud cost for that piece. Why is it costing X to run your stuff in the cloud? And so we're, as a responsible partner, we're going through that, but also going a little bit of outside our swim lane,
right,
and recommending to them in this particular case, you know what? You may want to take a look at some other tools that we don't sell, we don't have any interest in evaluating and putting some guardrails around your cloud costs.
Right. Yeah.
That's a for instance, right? It's go outside that swim lane a little bit, and I do that with customers because of my background.
Nice. So I mean, this has been great, and so Eric, thanks for spending the past hour and 20 minutes with me here, drinking bourbon together. It's been a lot of fun.
I've had a blast.
Awesome. Well, you're welcome back anytime, man.
You know where to find me.
All right, sir. Thanks again.
Cheers.
All right.
Bye-bye.